The champagne had gone flat in her glass. She wasn't even sure how long she'd been holding it. Maybe 20 minutes, maybe an hour. Time moved differently backstage at the Sands, where the velvet curtains absorbed sound like they were swallowing secrets whole. Marilyn Monroe stood in the narrow hallway just outside Dean Martin's dressing room, her fingers trembling slightly against the stem of the glass, watching the door like it might open on its own if she stared hard enough. It was sometime past midnight in the early 1960s, and Las Vegas was doing what it always did, glittering and roaring and pretending that morning would never come. She shouldn't have been there. That much was obvious to anyone who understood how these things worked. When you were Marilyn Monroe, every movement was catalogued, every conversation dissected, every glance turned into a headline. The studio handlers, the photographers lurking in every shadow, the gossip columnists with their poison pens, they were always watching, always waiting for the moment when the carefully constructed image would crack. And yet here she was, backstage at a venue where Don Martin was performing to a sold-out crowd, standing in a corridor that smelled of cigarette smoke and expensive cologne, wearing a dress that cost more than most people made in a year, utterly and completely alone. Dean had just finished his set. She'd heard the applause from where she stood, that thunderous wave of approval that rolled through the casino showroom like something alive. She'd heard his voice over the microphone, smooth as whiskey, making some joke she couldn't quite make out, followed by more laughter, more applause. Then the music had stopped, and she'd heard footsteps, and suddenly he was there, walking down the hallway with a towel around his neck, his tie loosened, his eyes registering surprise when he saw her. Marilyn, just her name. Not a question, not quite a statement. Something in between. Deanne. She tried to smile, that smile everyone expected, but it came out wrong somehow. Smaller, more real. He looked past her, down the hallway toward where his handlers would be waiting, toward where the party was already starting in one of the private rooms upstairs. Then he looked back at her, and something shifted in his expression, something she recognized because she'd seen it in her own mirror often enough. That wariness that came from being looked at, but never truly seen. That exhaustion that settled into your bones when you realized that no matter how many people knew your name, no one really knew you at all. "Come in," he said, and opened the dressing room door. She hesitated. She'd thought about this moment during the entire cab ride over, during the careful navigation through the casino floor where she'd kept her head down and her scarf up, during the conversation with the stage manager who'd looked at her like she was a problem that needed solving. She'd thought about what she would say, how she would explain why she was there. But now, standing at the threshold, all those prepared words had evaporated, leaving behind only the raw truth. She didn't know why she'd come. She only knew that she couldn't bear another night alone in her hotel room, staring at the ceiling, counting the hours until dawn. "It's okay," Dean said, gentler now. "Come on, before someone sees you and makes it into something it isn't." She stepped inside. He closed the door behind them. The dressing room was smaller than she'd expected, cramped and cluttered with the debris of performance. Costume pieces draped over chairs, makeup scattered across the vanity, a half-empty bottle of Jack Daniels on the small table by the mirror. The lights around the mirror were harsh, unforgiving, the kind of lights that showed every line, every flaw, every crack in the carefully maintained facade. Dean moved to the table and poured 2 glasses of whiskey without asking if she wanted one. He handed her a glass, took the flat champagne from her hand, and set it aside. "You look like you could use this more than that," he said. She took a sip. The whiskey burned, but it was a good burn, the kind that reminded you that you were still capable of feeling something. Outside, she could hear the muffled sounds of the casino, the slot machines, The laughter, the constant hum of money changing hands and dreams being gambled away. Inside this small room, there was only silence and the two of them, and the truth neither of them wanted to speak out loud, that fame was a prison, and they were both serving life sentences. Have you ever stood at a crossroads where every choice seemed impossible, where staying felt like dying slowly, but leaving felt like betraying everything you'd built? Where the person you were supposed to be had become so heavy that you couldn't remember the person you actually were? If you have, then maybe you understand what happened next. And if you haven't, well, maybe you should think about what you would do if you found yourself in that room with that silence, with that weight pressing down on both of you. Because what happened in Dean Martin's dressing room that night wasn't about scandal or romance or any of the easy narratives people would later try to force onto it. It was about something much simpler and much more complicated: two people trying to remember how to be human. Dean sat down in the chair by his vanity, his back to the mirror, his eyes on her. He didn't ask why she was there. He didn't make a joke or try to fill the silence with small talk. He just waited, and somehow that waiting felt like the kindest thing anyone had done for her in months. "I can't do this anymore," she said finally, the words coming out small and broken. "I don't know how to keep being her." He didn't ask who she meant. He knew. Everyone knew that Marilyn Monroe, the icon, and Norma Jean, the woman, were two different people living in the same body, and that the gap between them grew wider every year, every movie, every photograph. "Yeah," he said, "I know that feeling." And maybe that was all it took. Maybe that simple acknowledgement, that refusal to offer false comfort or empty reassurance, was enough to crack something open. Because she started talking then, really talking, about things she never discussed with anyone. About the pills she took to sleep and the pills she took to wake up, and how she couldn't remember the last time she'd felt truly rested. About the scripts that were all the same. The dumb blonde, the sex symbol, the joke that everyone was in on except her. About the photographers who treated her like a mannequin, and the directors who looked through her instead of at her, and the studio executives who talked about her like she was property to be managed rather than a person with thoughts and dreams and feelings and dreams that extended beyond what they wanted to sell. About the loneliness. God, the loneliness. Dean listened without interrupting. He poured more whiskey when her glass ran empty. He nodded occasionally, not with pity but with recognition, because he understood what she was describing in ways most people couldn't. He'd built his career on playing the easy, going drunk, the charming playboy, the guy who made it all look effortless. But the truth he'd never spoken in any interview, never revealed on any stage, was that the performance never ended in here. Even now, there was some part of him that was still performing, still maintaining the image, still afraid of what would happen if people saw past the carefully constructed character to the complicated, uncertain man underneath. She told him about the marriages that had failed because no one wanted to be married to a real person. They wanted to be married to Marilyn Monroe, and when she couldn't be that person 24 hours a day, when she was tired or sad or just wanted to exist without being watched, they looked at her with disappointment or confusion or anger. She told him about the pregnancy she'd lost and how no one had seemed to understand that she'd wanted that baby more than she'd wanted any role, any acclaim, any of it. How she'd wanted something that was hers alone, something that no studio could take away or reshape or use for publicity. She told him about the nights when she stood on her balcony and looked out at the city and wondered what would happen if she just disappeared. Not in the dramatic way the newspapers would describe it, but simply ceased to exist as Marilyn Monroe and became someone else. Someone ordinary, someone who could walk down a street without causing a scene, Someone who could fail without the whole world knowing. Someone who could be sad without it becoming a scandal. Dean's glass had stopped moving halfway to his mouth. He was staring at her now with something that looked like fear. "Don't," he said. Just that one word, but it carried the weight of real alarm. "I'm not going to do anything," she said quickly. "I just think about it sometimes, about what it would be like to stop."
Yeah.
He set his glass down carefully like he was afraid it might shatter. "I think about it too." And there it was, the thing neither of them had admitted to anyone else. The dark truth that lived behind all the bright lights and applause. They were both exhausted. They were both barely holding on. They were both playing roles they could no longer separate from themselves, and the lines between performance and reality had blurred so completely that they didn't know which version was real anymore, or if either version had ever been real at all. The flashbacks came then, unbidden. For Marilyn, it was foster homes and lonely birthdays, and being told she was pretty, but never that she was smart. It was studio executives who'd promised her the world and delivered her into systems designed to control her. It was being told to smile while photographers took pictures that would be used to sell products she'd never see a penny from. It was Arthur and Joe and all the men who'd said they loved her but really loved what she represented. Youth, beauty, unattainable desire made flesh. For Dean, it was different but somehow the same. Growing up poor, working every job imaginable, finally breaking through only to discover that success came with its own chains. The pressure to always be on, to always be the life of the party, to never show weakness or vulnerability or real emotion. The drinking that had started as part of the act, but had become something else, something darker, something he wasn't sure he could control anymore. The fear that if he ever stopped performing, if he ever let people see the real person underneath, they'd be disappointed. That the real Dean Martin wasn't nearly as interesting as the character he played. The room felt smaller now, the air heavier. Outside, someone laughed. Bright and carefree, the sound of someone who still believed the world made sense. Inside, two people sat in silence, each recognizing in the other a mirror of their own struggle. Marilyn stood up, paced to the small window that looked out onto an alley. Even here, even in this supposedly private space, she could see people moving in the distance, living their lives, free in ways she couldn't remember being free. "Do you ever wonder," she said softly, not turning around, "what it would have been like if we'd made different choices, if we'd said no more often, if we'd protected ourselves instead of giving everything away?" Dean was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was rougher than usual, stripped of the smooth confidence he wore like armor. "Every day," he said. "Every single day." She turned to face him. In the harsh light of the dressing room, he looked older than he did on stage, more tired, more human. The same transformation she knew happened to her own face when the camera stopped rolling and the makeup came off and she was just Norma Jean again, lost and confused and wondering how she'd gotten here. "What do we do?" she asked. "How do we keep going when it feels like this?" And that was the question, wasn't it? The question that hung in the air between them, heavy and urgent. Some people would look at this moment and see melodrama. They'd say that rich, famous people had no right to complain, that success solved all problems, that beauty and talent were enough to carry anyone through any darkness. But those people had never stood where Marilyn and Dean stood that night, caught between who they were and who everyone needed them to be, drowning in expectations they could never meet, suffocating under the weight of images they could never live up to. Dean stood up slowly, moved toward her. For a moment, she thought he might embrace her, might offer some physical comfort. But he didn't. He just stood beside her, close enough that she could feel his presence, far enough that they maintained their separate spaces. "I don't know," he said honestly. I don't know if there's a good answer. Here's where the story gets complicated. Here's where some people might say Dean should have told her to get help, should have called someone, should have taken action to save her from herself. Others might argue that what Marilyn needed wasn't rescuing, but simply being heard, being seen, being acknowledged as something more than an image or a problem to solve. Still others might insist that both of them were responsible for their own struggles, that no amount of fame or pressure excused the choices they made or the ways they dealt with their pain. Who's right? Was this selfishness? Two people indulging in their own misery instead of finding constructive solutions? Or was it humanity? Two people being honest about their suffering in a world that demanded they perform happiness at all costs? Write in the comments what you think, because this moment matters more than you might realize. They stood there by that window for a long time. Marilyn told him about her therapist, who seemed more interested in writing a book about her than actually helping her. Dean told her about the nights he drank alone in his hotel room, practicing his routines in front of the mirror until the jokes stopped being funny and started being just words. They talked about the friends they'd lost, either to death or to the distance that fame created between people who lived in the spotlight and people who didn't. They talked about their children and the guilt they felt for not being better parents, for letting their careers consume time and energy that should have gone to the people who actually mattered. They talked about fear, the fear of failing, the fear of succeeding, the fear that one day the phone would stop ringing and they'd realize that all they had left was the persona they'd created, and that without an audience, even that persona would cease to exist. The fear that they'd given up too much of themselves, that they'd traded their souls for applause, and that when the applause finally stopped, there would be nothing left inside. Marilyn started crying at some point, quiet tears that she didn't bother to wipe away. Dean didn't tell her to stop or offer her a tissue or try to fix it. He just let her cry, and somehow that permission to feel without judgment was more valuable than any advice he could have given. You know what the worst part is, she said eventually, her voice thick with tears. I used to love it. Acting, performing, being on camera. I loved the way it felt to transform into someone else, to tell stories, to make people feel things. But somewhere along the way, it stopped being about the work and started being about maintaining the image. And now I can't remember the last time I did something purely because I wanted to, without worrying about how it would look or what people would say or whether it would damage my career. Dee nodded slowly. Yeah, it's like you start out doing this thing because you love it, because it makes you feel alive. And then suddenly you're successful, and everyone has an opinion about how you should do it, what you should be, who you should become. And you try to please everyone, try to be what they need you to be. And one day you wake up and realize you've spent so much time being what other people wanted that you've completely forgotten who you actually are. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people who'd finally said out loud the things they'd been thinking in private for years. The silence of recognition. The silence of not being alone, even if just for this one night, in this one small room where the rest of the world couldn't reach them. Eventually, Marilyn checked the small watch on her wrist. It was late. Later than she'd realized. She'd been there for hours, and somewhere out in that casino, people were probably looking for her. Her handlers would be panicking. The gossip columnists would be crafting their theories. By tomorrow, there would be whispers about where she'd disappeared to, who she'd been with, what scandalous behavior she must have been engaging in. I should go, she said, but she didn't move toward the door. Yeah. Dean agreed, but he didn't move either. because leaving meant going back out into that world where they had to be Marilyn Monroe and Dean Martin again, where every word was scrutinized and every action judged, where vulnerability was weakness and honesty was currency to be spent carefully. In this room, for these few hours, they'd been allowed to be something else, something smaller and more fragile and infinitely more real. "Thank you," she said finally, "for listening, for not trying to fix me or tell me what to do." He gave her a small smile, sad around the edges. "Thank you for being honest, for reminding me I'm not the only one who feels this way." She moved toward the door, then hesitated. "Dean, that thing you asked earlier, about what we do, how we keep going. Yeah, maybe we just do this. Maybe we find the people who understand, and we're honest with them, and we remember that underneath all the rest of it, we're still human. Maybe that's enough." He didn't answer, but something in his eyes shifted. Not hope, exactly, but maybe the absence of complete despair. A small thing, but sometimes small things were all you had to hold on to. Marilyn opened the door carefully, checked the hallway. It was empty. Everyone had moved on to the after parties, to the late-night gambling, to their own dramas and celebrations. She could slip out unnoticed, just another shadow in a building full of them. She looked back one more time. Dean was still standing by the window, backlit by the harsh dressing room lights, looking more alone than anyone who just performed for thousands of adoring fans should look. "We'll be okay," she said, though she wasn't sure if she believed it. "Yeah," he said. "We will." She left, closing the door softly behind her. What happened in that room never made it into the newspapers. No gossip columnist wrote about it, no photographer captured it, no biography included in the official narrative. Years later, when people talked about Marilyn Monroe and Dean Martin, they'd discuss their films, their performances, their public personas. They'd speculate about their relationships and their struggles, but they'd do it from the outside, crafting narratives that fit their preconceptions about fame and success and tragedy. But the truth, the real truth, was simpler and sadder and more human than any of those stories. The truth was that on one night in Las Vegas, two people who were drowning in their own success found each other for a few hours and remembered what it felt like to breathe. They didn't solve anything. They didn't fix each other. They didn't start a secret romance or make promises they couldn't keep. They just existed together honestly and without pretense, in a space where the weight of their public images could be set aside for a moment. Was it enough? Maybe not. Both of them would continue to struggle, continue to fight battles that most people would never understand, continue to navigate the impossible space between who they were and who the world needed them to be. But for those few hours, they weren't alone. And sometimes when you're drowning, not being alone is the only thing keeping you afloat. The next morning, Marilyn flew back to Los Angeles. Dean started preparations for his next show. The world kept spinning, indifferent to private moments of human connection, hungry for the next scandal, the next headline, the next story that could be packaged and sold to an audience that wanted entertainment, not truth. If you've made it this far, you understand that this isn't the story the headlines would have told. This isn't about scandal or romance or the myths we build around famous people. This is about the cost of being seen without being known, about the weight of expectations, about two people trying to survive in a world that wanted them to be icons when all they wanted was to be human. That's why I tell stories like this. Not to gossip about the famous, but to remember that everyone, no matter how successful or beautiful or talented, is fighting battles we can't see. If this resonates with you, if you want more stories that look beneath the surface, hit that subscribe button. If you think this kind of storytelling matters, leave a like. And here's the important part. In the comments, tell me what story you want to hear next. What moment in history do you wonder about? What person do you think has been misunderstood? Because this community gets to choose what we explore together. You're not just watching. You're part of deciding what matters, what gets remembered, what truths we uncover together. The door to Dean Martin's dressing room was just a door. The night was just a night. But for two people who rarely got to be themselves, it was also a lifeline, a moment of grace, a small rebellion against the crushing weight of being perpetually watched and never truly seen. And maybe, in the end, that's all any of us are looking for. A space where we can be honest about our struggles, where we can be vulnerable without being judged, where we can be human instead of having to be perfect. Marilyn and Dean found that space together, however briefly. The real tragedy isn't what happened in that room. It's that they couldn't carry that space with them when they left, couldn't maintain that honesty in the bright lights and loud voices that waited outside. But for a few hours, in a small dressing room in Las Vegas, two people who were drowning helped each other remember how to breathe. And sometimes that's enough. Sometimes that's everything. On.